We all want to be heard, don't we? Even if not all our problems will be solved, and we don't expect everyone to agree with us all the time, it's important to us to at least be heard, and frustrating, even distressing when we're not. Well, in today's passage, Genesis 21, 8 to 21, we see a God who hears, even those who've been ignored by others. Well, to remind us of the overall significance of what we're looking at, remember that at the start of Genesis 12, God has made these great promises to Abraham. Go to the land that I will show you, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. God's chosen Abraham and his descendants to be agents of his blessing, sorting out the problem and curse of sin for all people. One could reasonably summarise then the rest of the Old Testament as Abraham and his descendants wrestling with this, sometimes trusting God to fulfil his promises, being great examples to us of faith when they do so, and sometimes doubting God's faithfulness, thinking they need to make things happen all by themselves, with predictably messy results. Yet God always remains faithful to his promises, whatever fine messes people have got themselves into. Well, the narrative we're looking at in this passage of Genesis 21, 8 to 21, shows us Abraham and Sarah reacting very badly to a situation which was itself caused by a previous instance of their faithlessness. Human failings are very much on display here. Yet in contrast, God's continuing faithfulness shines through all the brighter. But it's the human failings we have to endure first, mostly in verses 8 to 14. These failings are all the more shocking as they come in the immediate context of God's greatest display of faithfulness to Abraham and Sarah yet, as at the start of chapter 21, Sarah bears the son that God has promised. Despite her lifelong infertility and her and Abraham being well past childbearing age, God has miraculously enabled her to bear a son. He has proved himself faithful despite seemingly impossible circumstances, and Sarah laughs with joy, in contrast to her laughing with incredulity last week. And she names the boy Isaac, which means he laughs. Yet we quickly move from joyful laughter and family bliss to laughter causing jealousy, hatred, and some very ugly behaviour. For in verse 9, Sarah sees Ishmael, the son that Hagar bore to Abraham, laughing. We're not told whether Hagar's son really was laughing in mockery at Isaac. The word used here often does have that meaning. Or whether Sarah was reading too much into perfectly innocent laughter. I guess it's not specified because it doesn't really matter. Even if Ishmael had been mocking Isaac in some way, Sarah's reaction is clearly unreasonable, unfair, and frankly cruel. Cast this slave woman out with her son, for this son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. She doesn't even give them a name. They're just this slave woman and the son of this slave woman. It's a lot easier to mistreat someone if you've depersonalised them, as if they're not real people who deserve care and consideration. This is part of the reason so much interaction over the internet is so toxic. You can't actually see the real person you're arguing with or tempted to troll. They're just a username and an avatar. They're easily dismissed as some loony lefty or heartless Tory, SJW or hate mongerer who deserves nothing but your contempt. Whatever the means of interaction, we should never forget that we're interacting with real people, with feelings just like ours, to whom we should be kind, considerate, respectful, and gracious, no matter the strength of our disagreement. Sarah ought to care for Hagar and Ishmael simply because they're people, and she ought even more to do so because it's she and Abraham who are responsible for this situation. It was Sarah's idea in chapter 16 for Abraham to have sex with Hagar to give them the child that Sarah hadn't been able to have, and Abraham happily went along with it. They both failed to trust that God would bring about his promises to give them an heir, and tried to make things happen themselves. And they're responsible for these difficulties that result. Yet Sarah takes no responsibility, instead laying the blame on those who are powerless victims, refusing to even treat them as real people, just that slave woman and her son. They're nothing but problems to be cast out. And Abraham's no better. Despite Sarah clearly saying to get rid of both of them, Abraham, verse 11, is only displeased on account of his son. He's possessive about his son, but cares nothing for Hagar. She's just a slave woman to him too. Now God's response in verses 12 to 13, at first she can seem rather shocking to us. He seems to be colluding in Sarah and Abraham's callousness. Yet actually, we even here see him rebuking their attitude. And then as the rest of the events of this passage unfold, we see that God's attitude towards Hagar and Ishmael is the complete opposite of Abraham and Sarah's. We've seen how it was striking that despite Sarah saying, "Cast out this slave woman and her son," Abraham was only displeased on account of his son. Yet now God says, in verse 12, "Be not displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman," despite Abraham having notably not been displeased about her at all. This is classic biblical irony. God is rebuking Abraham for not having cared about Hagar as he should have. However, God does nonetheless allow them to be sent away. You see, Sarah's motives may have been entirely wrong, but she was right that it's Isaac who is the child of the promise. Isaac is the heir promised by God, and so the one through whom the fulfillment of God's promises would continue. And so for there to be clarity about God's promises, it's vital that there is no confusion about Abraham's true heir. However, whilst Sarah saw Ishmael only as a problem to be got rid of, the fact that he's not the one God's chosen to work through doesn't mean God cares any less about him. And verse 13, he says he will bless Ishmael just the same as Isaac. However, verse 14 shows that Abraham has heard only what he wants to hear, not what God has actually said, a tendency we all need to be aware of within ourselves. Whilst God has shown Abraham that he should care for Hagar and Ishmael as much as God does, all Abraham's heard is, "It's okay, you've got my go-ahead to get rid of this awkward problem." We know Abraham was a wealthy man, leading a substantial household with much livestock. He could easily have sent Hagar and Ishmael away with a donkey or two laden with provisions, a goat for milk, a few men to guide and guard them until they were safely settled somewhere. He should have taken that responsibility for them. Yet instead, he sends them off alone, wandering through the scorching desert wilderness, with just enough bread and water to be a sop to his own conscience. This whole story has been a sorry litany of human failings. And yet, just as we approach what looks like it's going to be the tragic conclusion of these failings, in steps God to show his faithfulness, from verse 15. Now, looked at in isolation, we could easily misread these verses to thinking that Ishmael was only a toddler, just old enough to childishly mock Isaac in some way, but basically still a helpless and dependent infant. But the wider narrative actually shows us that Ishmael would have been about 15 years old by this time. Still a child, but hardly an infant. He was a youth, a young man. So this youth and his mother were abandoned into the wilderness with the barest of provisions, and these soon ran out. So when Hagar puts the child down under one of the bushes, in verse 15, she's not lying a toddler down. Rather, she's doing something like saying to this young man, "Look, you sit here and wait while Mum goes and looks for water." And then she walks away, hiding the hopelessness of the situation from him, because she just can't bear to tell her son they're going to die. She waits until she's a good way off, before collapsing to the ground in hopeless tears. They've been abandoned and cast out. They're rejected and unwanted. But, verse 17, not by God, who speaks to Hagar through an angel. Now, strikingly, God doesn't say he's heard her tears, but that he's heard the voice of the boy. We can only presume that the lad was praying. To whom else could he have been speaking but God? And God hears his voice. God hears the voice and the cries of those whom their society has viewed as worthless. He calls by name she who had been unnamed and treated as just a problem, not a person. "What troubles you, Hagar?" he asks. Now, of course, God doesn't actually need to ask what's going on. God knows. But his question expresses the care and concern for Hagar that Sarah and Abraham had denied her. She is not a problem to solve for God, but a person whom he calls by name and addresses and treats with respect. To the one who has been treated as worthless, God says to her, "You matter. Your son matters. Your status in society has no impact on your worth in my eyes and my love for you." And as well as saying this, God shows they matter. He provides for their immediate need, giving them water, and he gives them hope and a purpose for the future. Ishmael too will be the ancestor of a great nation. And, verse 20, God remained with him as he grew. Ishmael may not have been chosen by God to play a central role in his plans as Isaac was. But someone's worth to God does not depend on their usefulness to him, as is sadly often the case with people and human societies. All people matter to God, and they matter equally, no matter the divisions, disparities and inequalities we people create through our many failings. And here we see an example of what we see throughout Scripture, that God often especially says to some people, whether individuals or groups, that they matter, when others have told them that they don't matter, or at least acted as if they matter less. That's how God acts, and so it's quite right for God's church, and for me as a minister in God's church, to say, Black Lives Matter. Because for all the laudable progress that has been made in recent decades, our society and the church still do not always act as if we actually believe that. Black lives matter. They matter to God, and we all need to take the responsibility for progressing our communities and our churches towards a point where this is our reality in all respects. All lives matter equally to God, and yet there's another group whose lives do not seem to matter so much to our society, about whom two significant pieces of legislation have recently been debated in our Parliament, with not a great deal of media attention. A person's value should not be dependent on how much they're valued by others, whether or not they are wanted by others, or how useful or inconvenient society may deem them to be. And yet, tragically, this is how our society effectively treats the unborn. Now, of course, there are many very difficult and tragic instances where an abortion may be the least tragic path that can be taken, such as when the evil of rape has occurred, or when the pregnancy causes a serious threat to the life of the woman, or other similar situations. But how can it be right that people with Downs, cleft palates or club feet or other disabilities are not afforded equal rights and protections with non-disabled people whilst they remain in the womb? Or how about the fact that I, to be quite blunt about it, was an accident? But thankfully, my biological mother decided that my life did matter, and so she bore me, and then had me adopted. And so she gave me the chance to grow up with my wonderful, loving, caring dad and mum, who gave me a great start in my life, and I've had the chance to live my life. How can it be right that other lives, who have come into existence in similar circumstances to me, may be ended in the womb, with effectively no consideration given to their worth? The unborn matter to God, as do women who find themselves pregnant in difficult circumstances, like Hagar did. The church should be speaking up for the unborn, and speaking up for and giving practical support to women and couples facing crisis pregnancy. And also, we should never judge or condemn any woman who has had an abortion. We cannot know their circumstances. And whatever those circumstances were, we must treat everyone with the same love, acceptance, and unconditional respect as God does. Well, this narrative, like many other parts of Genesis, has illustrated the mixture of faith and doubt, joy and jealousy, love and hatred that characterizes the human predicament. But above all, in it, God proves himself dependable, faithful, and gracious. He is faithfully performing his promises to each person. Although our sinful actions do matter, for they can and do cause much personal hurt, they cannot hinder God's ability to be faithful to his promises and caring and gracious to all people. God faithfully gives Abraham and Sarah their promised child, enabling the continuing progressive fulfillment of his promises. And God hears, calls by name, and cares for Hagar and Ishmael. And in doing so, God challenges us to hear, to speak up for, and to act for the unheard, the outcast, the deprived, and the unloved. In Jesus' name, Amen.